Welcome to Coming About with David Paragamian, the podcast that dives deep into the minds of leaders who have transformed their businesses and industries, paving the way for a better future. Here's Dave.
I'm so excited to welcome Risa Wexler to Coming About, where business leaders share their stories about their careers and their lives and the big decisions and the small ones where they made a pivot, they made a change, and had that coming about moment where they made transformation in a business, made transformation in their career arcs. Risa, I know you've got a number of very interesting points in your career where you made some brave decisions to make change and choose a new path. I'm anxious to hear your insights, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dave. I'm super excited to be here.
So I guess to start out, I know that you call yourself a self-described media nerd. You've worked for some of the biggest companies in the world, and I know you're now leading your own company. Let's go back and start at the beginning. When you came out of school, you embarked on a career in media and advertising. Did you know you wanted to be in advertising now that you have the benefit of looking back all these years?
Well, hindsight is definitely 20/20, but I can say for sure that I absolutely knew that I wanted to be in advertising. What I didn't know was what I wanted to do in advertising. When you're in college, I was a journalism major, and you don't really know what all the different careers are inside of advertising unless you have family members that are actually part of the business. And I did not have the benefit of it. So I knew I wanted to be in advertising. I just had no idea exactly what job I wanted. A friend of mine directed me to another friend that I actually knew from high school. And he told me all about his job as a media planner back in the day at Ogilvy. And I was just stunned. I could not believe what this guy told me that he did for a living. And I said, so let me get this straight. They pay you to know everything there is to know about all the different kinds of media that are out there. He said, well, they don't pay you a lot. And I said, yeah, but they pay you for that? And he said that they do. He said, long hours, low pay. I don't think that's changed much over the years for those starting out, but I could not believe that this was an actual career. Getting into something that I was always interested in and finding out that there was actually a career around it was just completely thrilling for me.
That's great. And I love that line about long hours and low pay. That's the fine print. That's not the headline. So you started out working on a lot of different industry verticals. I believe you started at what we used to call Y&R, right? In their media group. So you worked on a number of different verticals in consumer packaged goods and electronics and those sorts of things. Is there a particular part of the business or business vertical that was really memorable and you got great learnings from?
It's such a good question. The reality is I did, and I hope everybody does, learn something from every client that you work with, every category, every product, every brand, because they all have a lot to offer. So you learn in some worlds, like in QSR, I worked on Burger King for a bunch of years, which was so much fun. You learn about the crazy cycle of their promotions. I worked on AT&T, which also crazy cycle of their promotions. I worked on P&G, like everybody else in the business at some point in their career. Hopefully you get to work on that, which is a company that just is all about the discipline and the rigor. And it teaches you all the basics of what you're going to need. And with a foundation like that, you can kind of work on anything. I think what I loved most about working on all the different brands and what I learned most about them is that each one, while they have their similarities, they all have their, what I call their special sauce. And that's what makes them unique. And that's really where the learning comes in. So you can learn how to do the basics of, measurement, monitoring, whatever it is you're going to do on any brand. But if you can take that and marry that to the specific brand or product that you're working on, you can usually find what I would call a pony in there. You can find some nugget that will help you do better and be better for a particular brand or client.
That totally resonates for me. And I'm betting that for a listener, for a piece of advice to the listener, there's a real insight in that, what you said in terms of really digging in and learning about the client's business. Here it is all these years later, and you're still speaking with passion and insight about the difference between a quick service restaurant business like Burger King and the discipline of a Procter and Gamble and the pace of their promotional cycle versus a quick service restaurant or consumer electronics with AT&T. And it is, for me, same way I started my career in brand management at Procter and Gamble. And you use the word discipline, and that's what I always tell people. It's that if you're willing to dig in and break a few fingernails, you will really learn the discipline of the business. And it's such a great foundation for later on, right? I mean, it's so funny. I go back in my own career now, all these years later, I go back to so many things that I learned early on at Procter and Gamble.
I have to say that particular client is probably, I mean, most people that you talk to that have been in the industry long enough, they've all worked on it at some point, on the agency side at least. And I, of course, know lots of product people that also came from there. But there is nothing like the discipline and rigor of a Procter. I was working with a client just about 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about budget cuts. And I said, let me tell you something that I learned 100 years ago from P&G. And that is every time, and I don't know if they still do this, but every time that we made plans for them, we would also have to include a list in order of things we would add if we got more money and things that we would cut when the inevitable budget cuts came. And that's the kind of discipline that teaches you very early on how to plan, how to make sure that you're not scrambling and you're being strategic and very thoughtful in the work that you're doing, because you've already taken the time to think about it. And you've done it not under duress, but you've done it in the context of the larger plan, the whole brand plan. So you can make sure that you're contributing in the right ways at the right time. And then when and if that time does come, and it invariably will for almost every brand and client that you work on, whether it's budget up or budget down, you've already got that covered. You don't have to think about it. And it was a lesson that I think helped me prepare for working on so many other pieces of business, because no more scrambling. Like, before that, I had worked on things where you were just always scrambling. And this just taught me, like, in such a simple way, think about it in advance and you won't have to scramble later. And when you do have to execute it, not only have you already thought about it, but you've had a very strategic conversation about the trade-offs of adding or subtracting from your plans. So definitely the basics and the discipline and the rigor that you get with working on something like Procter, I think has been foundational for not just for me, but for so many people in the industry.
Yeah, and just to put a punctuation mark on that particular thought, as you explained the preparation and preparing for what would an up look like, what would a down look like, it strikes me as there's a life lesson in there too, right? That's not just about how you manage a media budget. That's how you manage your household budget. That's how you manage your workday. That's how you manage all the things that happen to you in life, because in life, nothing goes really according to plan. Your career, your personal relationships, your commute, and something is going to happen, and your ability to calmly adapt, knowing that you're still trying to navigate to a certain north point and achieve a certain objective, so important. I mean, I think that there's a media planning lesson and a life lesson tucked into that Procter story. I love it.
100%.
Is there anything, before we leave this chapter of your life and we talk about that first big, brave pivot you made to leave the agency side and go to the client side, is there anything that you now look back, knowing what you know today, that you would have told your younger self walking into those first jobs that you had, that things you wish you knew, or that you wish you could have told yourself with the benefit of hindsight?
One of the most important things, right? Like when you're a little kid, talk about life lessons, you're taught to be kind to everyone. And I think that is something that everybody should take to heart in the business world, because it's all about people. But I think the larger piece of that is look around you when you start at a company, when you start in this industry, look around you, because everybody in the room that started within a few years of you or at the same time as you, these will be the people that will be leading the industry in another 20 years. So if you're in it for the long haul, go back to the lesson you got as a kid, be nice to everyone. And I would add to that, keep in touch with all these people, because you never know when you're going to come across them. You never know when you're going to have a job for one of them, or they might have a job for you, or just to chat about what they're doing, like coming across people that I worked with a million years ago at places like the ANA, and I'm sure, similarly the 4As and the IAB and all these different places that we all gather. And it's just so cool to see how many amazing people, back when we were kids. And it's amazing and so fun to see them now and to see that they're all so successful. There are some that I think in hindsight, I was like, yeah, well, I know that person's going to be successful. But there were others that just sort of stuck around, did the hard work, and rose because of that. So it's not just the obvious with the dynamic, outgoing personality. There's lots of places and I think lots of room for lots of different people. So the learning that I have is to just look around you in the beginning, but also as you continue to advance in your career. And of course, be nice to everyone, but keep in touch with everyone and reach out to them often, not when you need them. Reach out to them regularly, like a good old-fashioned human being, whether it's a text message or a DM through a platform. It doesn't really matter. A phone call, meeting up with them at an event, at a conference, in Cannes, wherever you might be. But these are the people that make the industry run. These are the people that make the industry fun. And so it is both a good and smart thing to do, but it is also the piece that's going to make it very joyful.
That story really resonates for me, and I'll, again, try and put a punctuation mark on it, which is our old friend Noah could only bring 2 of each on top of the ark, but I think it's really important that for us in the industry, and your advice to younger people in the industry, really steer a big arc, bring as many people along as you can that you get the chance to work with, because as Mom used to say, you can learn something from everyone. And as you say, all of these people are going to be continually contributing to the growth and the leadership of the industry going forward. So their viewpoints, their perspectives, their stories, their histories, little nuggets that they can offer you, things you can offer them. I totally agree. I think the most valuable possession that I own is the inventory of names and phone numbers on my phone. Just the collection of individuals that I've been fortunate enough to work with over the years, and the insights that they can share, the stories that they can share. Fantastic. No, that totally resonates for me. And I know that for me, the most valuable thing that I've accomplished in the years that I've been in the industry is just bringing a lot of people on the ark with me. I love that.
I love that the most valuable thing you have is your basically your address book, because it's really very true, right? It is. There's no thing you can take with you, but it's those people that will create those memories and those lasting bonds, which is far better than another dusty thing that you may have. I love that.
And to your point, when you can help someone else, do it.
Oh, there's nothing better. There's nothing better than being able to help somebody else, and not because you expect something in return. That's literally the worst thing you could do, because you'll be disappointed and frankly, you won't be liked for it. So if you can just genuinely help somebody else out, there's nothing better than that.
Yeah, no, there is karma, and all things will work out in the end. But if you can do the right thing for somebody, it's the right thing to do. Well, so let's make that first big pivot. So you worked at Y&R, you worked in the Publicis organization at Spark. You have this upward ascending career in these really world-class media agencies, and working across multiple verticals, from AT&T to Burger King to Procter & Gamble. And then you make a pivot and you go to Big Blue on 42nd Street, one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Pfizer. Tell me about that decision. That's a big, bold pivot and a big, brave decision. Tell me about the decision to join Pfizer.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I was thinking pharma, finance, or auto. Those are 3 categories that I had yet to work in. And one thing that I always loved about working on the agency side was you could change jobs and keep the same lunch place, and the bathroom was in the same place. I just love that. So you're in an agency and you're working on one client today, and you work with that client for a year, and then you start working with another client that's totally different. And it's literally like getting a brand new job. And I really, really enjoyed that because it was just challenging and you got to learn a lot and meet new people. At the time, I was thinking 3 categories that I haven't yet worked in were pharma, finance, and auto. Just hadn't done them, so it would be intriguing to be able to work in one of them. And so when the Pfizer role came up, it was interesting to me because it was a bit new. I was there 20 years, right? So think back, it was the Bob Dole Viagra days. And so it was a pretty new category at the time. And it was completely different from all the other work that I had done to date. One client that I forgot to mention was the U.S. Army at YNR, which was an absolute hoot. I got to drive a tank. And that was really a lot of fun, and talk about really very different. But, the other side of that and all of those things that I worked on was pharma, which was very, very different. The learning curve was massive. It wasn't a curve. It was just a straight up vertical line. I mean, it was like every single thing was new and different, everything about it. You couldn't do anything straight out of the gate without running it past lawyers and doctors and regulators. And I mean, that is a foreign world if you're not used to that at all. So the learning curve was really steep. I think I recall I was 2 years in and I was still climbing a vertical to get to a place where I could speak the language. I mean, it really was like a foreign language, which kept it incredibly interesting. It made it very challenging and at times a little frustrating, which is what I know most people on the outside think, is that it's so frustrating. But it really kept it very interesting. And these were also the smartest people that I had ever collectively as a group that I had ever really worked with. There's a lot of smart people in media, but you step inside the walls of a company like that and there are no chuckleheads in the building. Everybody was super smart and super credentialed. I used to joke that I don't know how they let me in. And it took months and multiple rounds of interviews and all that sort of stuff. In fact, funny story is that when I was interviewing at the time, I mentioned somebody on the team to the person that I was talking to, and she said, well, how do you know that about her? And I said, well, I Googled it. And she was like, what's that? Again, this was 2003. And she literally got out of her chair and I showed her how to use Google. And that's how I got my job. And that was really my pattern and it goes back to that conversation that I had with my friend from high school, which was like, I knew all of this stuff and I was enamored by all of it. And whether I was getting paid for it or not, I was interested in it and I was going to be aware of what it was and read about it and study it. And so that time, having the knowledge of something that she didn't have the knowledge of turned out to get me the job, which was really kind of cool. Being on the client side was also really interesting and super different. And I would say the biggest learning there from going agency to client side was that when you're on the agency side, 100% of what everybody does is media. When you're in the media world on the client side, it's like 10 or 20%. I used to say it's like a pinhole. And on one side of the pinhole, 100% of the people are doing one thing. On the other side, they're doing 100 other things. So I maybe spend 10 or 20% of my time as a client talking and working directly with the agency. The rest of my time was on everything else that had to be done. So, it's just a much more vast and complicated world because you're not just talking about the media plan or the media buy or whatever strategy, whatever it is that you're working on. You're talking about how that fits into a much larger picture of everything else. And so it put everything into perspective for me about what the client work really is versus what the agency work is. And there's just a ton to learn on the client side that has nothing to do with where I came from on the agency side. And so what I would tell people is that what you might see as a request landing to you as executive or crazy, you have to give the benefit of the doubt to know that there were 5, 10, 20, or 100 people who actually made that decision. And it's for reasons that you couldn't fathom, because there's so much more that's going on that you can't see. And so it's actually probably a very thoughtful and rigorous decision by the client. But because the agency side doesn't always get to see all of that, sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect. So there's just so much more that goes into it being on the client side than being on the agency side. Both sides are equally complicated and the stakes are equally high, but I guess the composition of the work is completely different from one side to the other.
Those are some great stories and a couple things that are certainly worth unpacking. One of them was the reflection that you made about this almost incredibly steep asymptotic learning curve. You said the first 2 years, and it would be easy for someone in that position to say, gosh, I made a mistake. This is too hard. This is too different. But clearly one of the things that you did was you pushed through. It was about grit. It was about, wait a minute, there's a reason why there are rules and regulations and this wonderful RC committee with medical, regulatory, and legal meeting every 2 weeks to review what we say and do. So let me understand that. Let me push through and learn that. So, clearly one of the lessons here, it seems like to me, is the grit of when you make a change like this, accepting and understanding that it's going to take a little extra effort. Is that fair?
Oh, that is 100% true. I would, in some ways though, I would kind of flip the coin on that a little bit and say, for me, I don't know if it was grit, although that's definitely something that you need going in. It was something new and something interesting. And, I'm not the person to make up the line that if it's too easy, it's not worth it. It's hard and it's interesting. It's when it's hard and it's not rewarding. That's when it takes grit and you have to decide, do I stay or do I go? To quote a great band. But if it's hard, but it's interesting, you kind of can't find a better mixture than that, because you're learning a ton. And I got to tell you, I was learning for years. You're learning a ton while you're doing good work and meeting new people, and it's super interesting. So it's a little bit of I look at it from a little bit of a different lens, and that it was hard and it was worth it because it was really good stuff to be doing.
Yeah. And of that good stuff, I know that you were at Pfizer during that era when the transition took place from Pfizer representatives carrying traditional paper-based sales aids to, for example, digital, iPad-based selling tools. And while we now, from a 2023 lens, of course, that's the norm. And there's something beyond an iPad-based selling tool in the future. But back in that era that you're talking about when you joined Pfizer in the early 2000s, in that 05, 06, 07, that was an era when paper was going away, digital was happening. Tell me a little bit about that. That must have been sort of pushing through some new frontiers. Talk about interesting.
Oh boy. So there's two worlds that you live in. You live in the inside world and you live in the outside world. The inside world is your job, your company, and the outside world is what you do every single day outside of there. For many people, the outside world and the inside world were separate. For me, it was the same thing. And so, building on the last question of it takes grit, it was really more of a frustration that people didn't understand. You're doing this at home. Why wouldn't you do this at work? Like, there's no difference to me. I don't see why you think there should be different standards in this building versus outside of this building. Because when you, as I would say, pick up my phone and I would ask somebody what time it is by reading it on my phone, right? And they would say, it's 3:30. And I would say, is that the digital time or is that the actual time, the real time? And they would say, well, it's the time. And I would say that's correct. There's no such thing as the digital time versus it's the same thing. And that's how I describe digital marketing forever and always. Don't call it digital marketing. It's just marketing. Digital is just the way that things are delivered or created. But there's really no difference. But moving an organization from analog and linear, the old traditional stuff, to digital and social and all these technological tools, I mean, this wasn't just me. This was a massive shift for not just a pharma company. I mean, over and over, we hear the story to this day of companies making the digital transformation. I mean, we're all sick of hearing about it because at this point, from what are you transforming or transitioning? Like, if you're not there, what are you, like, first inventing the wheel? Are you using candles to light your office? It's not a distinction anymore. It shouldn't be a distinction anymore. Now, there were definitely a lot of pains and growing pains in going from that analog linear world to the digital social tech world. But one thing I always liked to do was look for what I called friendlies. And I had these people in legal, regulatory, medical, compliance, privacy, all around the company. I had like a little band of friendlies. And when I needed something to be approved, because it hadn't been done before in pharma, the dreaded words that we all hear too often, these are the people who understood that home and office people behave the same way. So they understood why it was important to find a path forward in whatever was new at that time. So I called that hand-to-hand combat, where I would go to the people who I knew could help me, and we could figure out a path forward versus just sort of bluntly throwing something down on the table and trying to get it forced through. That was never going to work. You had to be much more surgical, if you will, in your strike to get these things approved. But it was and still is for some things. I mean, everything that comes up is sometimes considered net new, but I'm hoping that there's a point now where people are like, okay, this is just a little bit more. It's not a lot more, or it's 10% different than the last social platform. So it definitely has gotten easier over the years, but as people in the roles change, sometimes you have to teach them again and again from scratch.
And it's funny, the observation that you make, and I observed the same thing in the industry working with the same companies at the same time, is that this was not only a transition from analog to digital as a medium, as a media, but it also changed the way we work internally. So you talked a little bit about that linear, logical, waterfall, step by step. And for most of the world, everyone has made that adaptation that we must be much more agile. We must work in that new fashion in order to adapt to the pace and the speed. So this is one where business processes had to adapt to catch up to the pace that the medium was demanding. So obviously an exciting time to be where you were. And I certainly think it's an observation that I think you'd agree with in terms of, just as I listen to your language, the language of agile versus the language of waterfall, it changed the way we work.
100%. It's funny you mentioned agile as a way of working, because that was something that we had started to do about, 5 years ago or so. And everybody said it can't be done. And of course, if you figure it out, you can find a way and you can do the work. But I think the bigger lesson of that for me was, once again, it was something new that people would resist because it was new. But if you found the right people to champion it and to have a different kind of mindset, then you could get the work done. But it really required people thinking thinking in ways other than, well, we've always done it this way before. I mean, to me, that's the kiss of death. If someone says, well, because that's what we've always done it, I'm sort of like, okay, well, now I'm going to react against it just because you said that. It gives the opposite reaction in me, where, it's like it's throwing down the gauntlet if you say, well, that's what we've always done it. I'm like, okay, well, then that's not the way we're going to do it anymore. But, working in agile was, as an example, is no, it's not a new platform. It's just another way of working versus waterfall and your basic Gantt chart. But it also requires training. But once again, we used to do this thing called, the anatomy of, and it was in order to explain to people who didn't know what something like a tweet was or a post, a social post, we literally got massive like whiteboards or sheets of paper and drew what would happen to this piece of content. So it was the anatomy of this piece of content that came out of RC that was approved. Where could it go in the wild, wild world of the interweb once we put it on this new platform? And what we did with that was we showed them what the possibilities were so they had a better understanding of what the real danger was versus reflexively saying no because it was new. So it just all kind of goes back to this education piece of if you can teach people what this stuff is. And that's why I always found the friendlies, because they would help their colleagues understand, their peers, what this thing was and that it's not so scary. One of the things we did at one point years ago was no one understood streaming. So we literally brought in every streaming device and hooked everything up and said, okay, let's just play with this stuff. And so it was like the Amazon Fire. It was like the first Google Chrome. It was a Roku box. It was a Sling at the time. Like all of these different ways that Apple TV, I guess, all these different ways that you could get TV now. And again, it was just about educating them on what this was, how it worked, so they had a better understanding of, oh, I get it. I have to be looking, from my legal or regulatory perspective, I have to be watching out for this thing over here, not these other 20 things over here that I keep hearing people talking about. Because of the way that system technologically works, it's not mine to monitor and make sure it's compliant. It is compliant out of the box, but I have to worry about this thing over here. So we were able to teach them what it was and focus them on the areas where we needed their assistance to make things compliant.
You know, Risa, as you're talking about getting people to change old paradigms, old ways of thinking, one of the things I wrote about in my book, and I talk about it all the time with my employees, is this concept of one-way doors and two-way doors when you're making decisions. A one-way door is a decision you can't undo. So, you can't unfire somebody. That's a one-way door. But when you're embarking on an innovation strategy, a media strategy, well, those things are two-way doors. If it doesn't work out, we'll adapt, we'll change, we'll go back through the door and do something differently. And I think, again, it's just this whole mindset shift that you talk about in terms of asking people to think in an agile manner, to borrow the term from agile project management. I love that. Well, hang on there, Risa. We have to stop here. But coming up next time with Risa Wexler on Coming About, she'll share her gratitude for the wonderful career journey she's had in media.
Media is the most fun business that I could have ever imagined falling into. When I first started out, all my friends had other jobs making three times the amount of money that I was making. And they were jealous at how much fun I was having.
This has been Coming About. We hope these conversations have left you feeling empowered and ready to take your organization to the next level. To speak with Dave about your business transformation or to learn more about Health Monitor Network, go to healthmonitornetwork.com. And don't forget to check out his book, Coming About, How We Transformed a Major Media Company and the Lessons There for You. Available wherever books are sold. Coming About with David Paragamian is a production of Advantage Audio.